George Steiner, some years ago, many people thought it was a shame and a disgrace that you were passed over as a member of the faculty at Cambridge. Did that rankle?
That's a very difficult question, because part of old age is to begin seeing both sides of a question. I think there were mistakes, certainly, on both sides. And in one sense, I'm very lucky. Rough hew them how we may, I didn't know that where I should perhaps be able to develop a multilingual teaching and something very much at the heart of Europe was waiting for me in Geneva. So it didn't turn out, I hope, too badly.
Did that decision teach us something about the difference between English and European intellectual life?
Oh, undoubtedly. I struck many of my peers or masters in England, and I do now, as somehow very continental, almost physically, almost in the way I speak and teach, a polyglot, and a person very much, I suppose, committed to the passionate heresy that it's marvelous to have roots, I love trees, and a tremendous improvement to have legs, to be able to move. And that's been at the center of my whole work. And that is a kind of peregrine or pilgrimage which, for a doctrine, for a school of English literature, whose shibboleth word is inwardness and rootedness, there was a very real difference of sensibility.
Is our sensibility here too parochial? Is our academic life too cloistered in that way?
At a time when science is still absolute world rank in Britain, at a time when Europe is beginning to draw near, though in a very difficult way, I wouldn't want to use the word parochial. There has been a period of a certain kind of nationalism, of Little Englandism. There has been a very sharp feeling of trying to survive against the overwhelming pressures of the American language and of that boomerang of world talent and power of a globe that speaks English but doesn't quite speak English.
What are your relationships like in Cambridge today, where you're now an honorary fellow and visit?
Oh, I live there half the year. My wife is a don in full harness, and the younger generation don't even remember that there was such an event. They're very cordial indeed, but I don't do any teaching whatever, and I'm very privileged. I can do my own research and my own writing, and the ghosts out of that past, it's now 15 years or 20 years ago, are like myself, I hope, people with a gift for forgetting.
You said polyglot a moment ago. How many languages do you read in?
I read, perhaps in 4 or 5, and stumble in a few more. I was brought up speaking 3, and in those I write and I can dream in them. And among those 3, very probably there isn't a first language.
Those are English, German, French.
Yes.
Yes.
And in Geneva, I'm allowed in the chair of comparative literature, which is a pretentious way of saying that you read works, if you can, in the language in which they were written and read first. I'm allowed a great range of language with my students. Remember, around my table there, as there might be in Amsterdam or Stockholm, almost every one of my students speaks a good many more languages than I do.
Which other ones do you read in? Do you read in Russian and Italian?
I speak Italian full of happy errors, read in it constantly, and am beginning to be ambitious enough to want to lecture in it. In order to read an author who's immensely important to me, Kierkegaard, with a dictionary and having German inwardly, I find I can follow a lot of Danish. Lots I can't, but I'm not helpless in it. And now it's becoming, anyone interested in literature, it's Spanish, which is just knocking at our doors. I mean, it's the most exciting, probably, literary language at the moment, and one tries to make some progress there. It's very difficult. It's one of the great illusions that if you speak Italian, you think, I can do it. You can't. But there also the errors of fun.
Greek, ancient Greek?
I was trained as a classic. I do a lot of writing about the classics. Certainly totally unreliable. Totally unreliable. A trot, facing pages, and the hope the hope that one's teachers of the long-distant past don't hear one trying to do it.
Because translation is something that's always interested you.
Central to everything I do. But I'm convinced we translate within our own same language. As you and I speak to each other, the complex exercise of decipherment, of trust, of being on guard, of trying to read between the lines, of trying to hear the overtones, the undertones, the ironies, the connotations, that too is translation. All my work has begun from the sense of the utter miracle, the crazy miracle of being able to communicate at all. And decisive, when I was very young at the University of Chicago, there was a clinic for autistic children, a very great thinker. He's still alive, Bruno Bettelheim, a man to whom we all owe an immense lot. He allowed me to work with those children where no translation is possible, where it's trapped deep within. Or the case of Cordelia. Who kills everybody in the play King Lear? It's Cordelia. It's when you can't translate outward that murderousness follows. So you don't need two different languages for the whole wondrous enigma of translation.
What have you been reading this week?
A whole number of things, and you really put your finger on a key question. First half of my answer is embarrassed. I review books. And of course, when you're a reviewer, they do very much come your way. I've just been deeply involved with a large new biography of Anna Freud, which is about to appear. I'm being asked to have a look at the first big life of the Spanish poet Lorca, an enormously fascinating figure and whose death was a very tragic one. So there is that part of work. But for personal reading, which is very early morning and then whenever I can, the absolutely quiet and concentrated reading, I have been rereading, just at the moment, quite a bit of Chaucer. And this is not directly connected to my teaching, but I was recently up in the Rylands Library in Manchester giving a lecture, and they showed me one of the few Caxtons in perfect shape, and the words were so electric on that first Caxton sheet that I've been absolutely mesmerized again since. There can be a physical shock which puts you onto a text.
Let's go back and tell me about your childhood.
I owe everything to a father who, as very often in a Jewish house, said the one thing you've got to do is try and be a teacher or scholar or writer, something like that. However limited what you can bring, that great dream, that generational dream. It's, after all, the only faith, so far as I know, where once a week on the Sabbath it is a blessing for scholars spoken in the synagogue, which is quite a hair-raising thing if you think of it, a marvelously strange idea. So I owed to that and to the French lycée in Paris, where I was brought up, those open habits of ambition which, again, in this country are judged very, very suspect. A school child in this country may wish one day to have a blue plaque in London on his house of birth. He'd better not mention that. Whereas we in France, we came through Rue La Fontaine, Place Victor Hugo, Square Racine, and the moment even a 5 or 6-year-old walked into one of those barracks, military barracks they were too, he was yelled at, saying maybe 1 out of 100,000 of you is worth having because you too will write a book that matters, or a poem, or a theorem, or a piece of music. This open, elitist clericy, yes, this education for passionate clerics formed me very, very deeply.
Were you told that you were one of 100,000?
No. Oh, they wouldn't let you know that. On the contrary, they encouraged a kind of rather dangerous rivalry. This is that old French pyramid system. One will claw his way a little upward, the others will fall behind. It's quite extraordinary. We're celebrating the second centennial of the French Revolution. There is, of course, no more aristocratic country than France. Nothing has happened to change that sense of what the French call the concours, the Grand National, where you leap over barrier after barrier in the hope that one day, vous êtes aussi, you also will be someone whose books you will teach. And if you drum that into a young child, it can have a very dangerous and very deep impact.
And it did on you.
I certainly was formed by it, and then was immensely fortunate, pure miracle. My friends in the class, the other children of my faith were, of course, all died, and their families, by pure miracle, were able to get out in 1940, but continued in the French system, the French lycée in New York, and more or less in that system till my American universities.
Jewish mothers are important too. Tell me about your mother.
A Viennese lady of great elegance, of a wonderful irony and cynicism, the grande dame of the Viennese world, she taught me a perilous prayer. And now that I think back on it, it's your question that brings it back. She taught me to pray, I'm bad, I could be better, but it really doesn't matter, amen, which is a kind of agnostic cynicism. Now that I think back of it, all of Vienna, 1890, 1900, laughs in that little rhyme. She was a wonderful linguist who used to begin deliberately a sentence in one language with me, and then it would always end in another one. And it was very late that people began telling me that there were people who had one absolute bedrock language. I remember being surprised by that.
You've talked of yourself as a sort of survivor and written of yourself as that. And a moment ago you talked about the miracle that saved your life. At what age were you conscious of what had happened to your schoolmates?
Immensely early, no, before. Things now completely forgotten. There was a big financial scandal in France in 1934 when I was 5 years old, and in 1936 when I was 7. And we had to run home down the street because people behind us were yelling rather Hitler than Blum, Leon Blum, the Jewish prime minister. And a number of times I remember the shutters being shut in our apartment as crowds of extreme right-wingers, what were later to be the Vichy militia, were pouring down the street. And I remember I was never allowed to be in any way afraid. My father, a master of psychology, took me to the window to watch one of these mobs and said, look closely, this is called history. I shall never forget that. And in a sense, there was no more fear for me. This is called history. Mon petit, c'est l'histoire. And that can be a turning point in a child's life. I thought it, like he, that it was unutterably fascinating, however dangerous, and interesting to be alive at all in a major historical period. So Hitler's voice thundered over my childhood on the radio, fully conscious from 37, 38 on. It was just a question when.
What are your early memories of pleasure? What gave you happiness as a child?
Oh, immense. First of all, gluttony. I still fight it bitterly. At 10 in the morning, you had a short break in the lycée courtyard, and there was a hot pain au chocolat, untranslatable into English. It's a little roll with warm chocolate in the middle, and the smell of it coming around the Rue de la Pompe, I can still exactly hear, and the footfall of the lady who brought them. A lot of wonderful Viennese and French things to eat and to drink, landscapes, very, very early on, the mountains, which are still one of the reasons I'm in Geneva, is to be very close to the high mountains.
Do you walk in them?
Yes, I walk in them. I hike a little in them. I used to hike a little more. And then the magic of reading. Let me tell you one tiny, simple story, 2 seconds, but it really fills the whole picture. I must have been 4.5. My father took a Greek Homer and translated for me from some unbelievably exciting episode. The spear is lifted above the kneeling man, or the arrow is flying towards, or the horse is rearing, and I'd be out of my mind with excitement, and Papa would put on a lugubrious mien and say, I don't know how to explain this to you, there's no translation for the next line, which I believed completely and passionately, and he said, shall we try to construe it? And that's how I began. And those were the ecstasies, the great ecstasies, and of those I was very fortunate.
Have you any idea how old you were at that point?
Oh, yes, this was 5. We began that little exercise at 5. I'm to this day total reactionary hyena. I believe there is no such thing as starting too early.
You're a Jew. What does that mean to you?
That I belong, first of all, to a club which in the century of Auschwitz one does not leave and does not resign from, whatever might be the temptations or advantages.
I mean, is it a club that you can resign from?
Oh, in the United States, the present best estimate, and I'm not a sociologist, but those who know say over 1/3 are passing into changed names, mixed marriages. My grim feeling is that won't work. But I hope I'm wrong. By God, I hope I'm wrong, because why shouldn't it work if that's what they want? For me, it's an inconceivable act, but there it is. I respect it. I can see it in others. It means, above all, belonging to a people whose survival is an enigmatic challenge. My God, the Romans were gifted, the Greeks, the most gifted people they've ever been on this. Why not they? Why this stubborn, scattered little tribe? And everything I've written strives to the answer, we are meant to be the people who, despite all the pain and horror, are guests of each other, are guests on this earth, must learn to be good guests, not ever in an armed nationalistic camp. That's why I'm not in Israel. That's why I'm deeply anguished about Zionism. We are guests of life, Jeremy. Of this I'm convinced. Why we're invited onto this scarred planet, I don't know. We're making a garbage dump of it. I think what Judaism inherently says is, if there is an element of miracle in this history of these people, and there is, because it's common sense defies, it defies all probability, it is to keep moving, to know that almost everywhere on this earth is worth working in and knowing human beings and trying to contribute something. And this is Judaism for me.
But all the same, you talked a moment ago about those who assimilate. Each of us has to keep a balance between the particularity of our culture and a common humanity, which is different from it, is wider than it. I mean, how do you see those two in your own life?
I certainly haven't solved that problem, but what you call my culture would be that Central European Jewish humanism, out of which exploded the tragedy and the genius of the 20th century, whether it be modern science and physics, or whether it be relativity theory, or psychoanalysis, or Marxist socialism and messianic economics, or the great writers and thinkers. In that sense, my homeland is a typewriter, and quite honestly, Proust said you can only write in a hotel. Wittgenstein often remarked that it was a railway station where you can do really deep, analytic, consequent work. I think it's rather marvelous.
A part of that genius, to use your phrase, also a representative of it? You sometimes sound as if you seem to be so.
No, most eminently not. What I hope to be is something which was defined so wonderfully by Pushkin. He said, look, I write the letters. I'm one of the greatest poets ever. You, sir, can be a mailman. You will carry it for me. You will know where to post it. A teacher, a critic, a scholar as I am, is not a great creative thing, but he can be a very good mailman. I hope from time to time to know in which slot to put the letter.
More than a mailman, surely. I mean, in the new book, you actually make a contrast between real writing, real art, and commentary upon it. You're not saying that you're just a commentator, are you?
I'm probably mainly a commentator. No man should have a very accurate sense of his own hopes. He should have a very sharp sense of his own constraints. As you know, I've done fiction from time to time. When I try to look back, and books that have had almost too much noise about them, such as the Hitler novel of some years ago, which has gone pretty much around the world in one way or another. When I look back, I say a great artist has an innocence which a person like myself can't even guess at. He has an immediacy. When I think of a story, there's usually an idea in it, an argument, a way of attempting to convince you, or to give a more moving form of proof. And of that one has to be very, very careful. That is not that mystery of the immediate. Watch a very great sculptor, I have no names mentioned, who had an association with my college in Cambridge, one of the greatest, so it's quite obvious whom I'm talking about. When he opened his mouth on politics, one did feel, good heavens. And then, if one watched his hands on the table, one knew what total intelligence is. It was in the hands.
Of course, but this is a serious point for you, because you want to tell us that art has a meaning, even a holiness. And yet it can coexist with the simple, practical, physical business of knocking chips off a block.
But that's the marvel of it. I've just been rereading a conversation with the very late Goethe, and he was asked about how he could do Faust and all the rest. He gets very, very angry. He said, if I knew, I couldn't have done it. And he said, the strangeness of it is that the mystery of total creative power goes far beyond any rational or positive understanding. It is not analytic. He could still speak, as I try to in this book, of some kind of relationship to a supernatural, to a transcendent, possibly to a divine agency. The great artist is as close as we sometimes get to having some inkling of what is very much larger than us and what created the damn thing.
I was talking to a painter last night, though, who said he was listening to you on the radio the other day, expressing precisely that thought. And as you were talking, he was painting, and all he was doing, as far as he was concerned, was putting paint on the canvas and wondering what he was going to have for dinner. I mean, don't you think that there's that this what you detect in art may be an unconscious process in the artist?
Let me make two tiny observations, very difficult question. It is quite conceivable that when Mozart writes the kind of theme that possesses us forever, or Schubert, which for many of us changes the earth, one ear is indeed listening to the kitchen or wondering whether he can pay the bill. We understand very little about a Mozart, a Schubert, or a Shakespeare, first of all. I would say that what they say of what they do often has a wonderful, ironic modesty, which is difficult for us to judge. Second thing is, I can just imagine, if pushed into a corner, that after writing To Be or Not to Be, he comes home and is asked, how was it today? Well, not bad. Just imagine. I think it's silly, but I can just... That doesn't work for me with supreme music. I do not know how a Schubert or a Beethoven, and Beethoven is totally convinced of a divine mystery within him, totally.
I think other composers have not been, but you think there's something holy in music.
There is in music a kind of assurance of dimensions which we know are profoundly meaningful, and we can't paraphrase them for a single minute. We talk about them and it's usually rubbish, utter tosh. They change our lives and we don't have a clue how they do this when they get inside us. I think that's a lot to go for.
Some people's lives are changed, many people's lives are changed by rock music.
Yes.
Something holy in that?
I say that specifically in the book. Look, in my case, the example I give as one of the things that change everything is as it happens in Edith Piaf tune, which if it were starting in the studio now, everything in me would in a curious way begin hammering, resonating, but far deeper than any psychosomatic level. I think almost every kind of music can do. The famous remarks of Eliot, Noel Coward, others, wonderful Noel Coward scene, the cheap tune that is so unbearable that you can't even face love after that. I don't know about that, but I know it's a fact. Yes, of course, it can be a vast range of music.
Is silence important?
Immensely. I've talked too much about it, as people always...
Are you ever reduced to silence?
Oh, very often. In front of great art, music, in front of certain other human beings. Absolutely. This is why, another great heresy, this is why there are moments when I have difficulties with Shakespeare. There is such overwhelming constancy of saying everything. There are forms of great drama. There's a play by the French playwright Racine, where there's a single word, and adieu, nothing is in an immense sound. A man and a woman face each other. No forests march to Dunsinane, no ghosts, no bodies, a man and a woman who will never meet again. And the universe collapses, because to leave someone one loves supremely or to not meet again is to me the apex of intensity of the tragic. Yes, there are forms of art, great music is full of them, the pauses and rests in great music. And I can't be silent here today, this would be, but many of your questions, when I will think back on them in a few moments, I will be very silent.
There are two sorts of scholarship. I mean, that's a ludicrous generalization, but some people connect great ideas across centuries, and other people write about a subject. Are you ever going to do, have you chosen to do one? Are you ever going to do the other?
I hope I've done both. The book before this is called Antigones and is a massively, footnoted and pretty demanding study of a single theme, that of a great Sophocles play in all its versions and inner problems, including some of the original text problems. At other times, yes, I have been too disseminated to write. I haven't chosen that. One's passions, jump at you. They lie in ambush. Almost everything I've written comes out of a great need, out of a great passion. And sometimes I do get a little intemperate with academic cowardice in these respects. Cows have fields, I know. not every human being needs to.
What are you most certain of in this world?
That it is worth trying. That if anybody took that away from me, I would have nothing left. Now, he comes to you, let's call him the devil, because I'm of that heresy which is quite sure about hell and very doubtful about heaven. That's one of the most dangerous heresies, but I've no doubt at all about absolute evil. But suppose he comes to you, usually very elegant, the gentleman with the cloven hoof, when you're a young child, or at the moment of puberty, and he says, you have 1 30-second period to choose a bargain with me. I'll give you the chance to try to create something, to put your nail on the wall and make a little scratch, a tiny one, in the history of science, art, thought, music, mathematics, dance, whatever it is. And you'll be miserable, because 99.9% you won't pull it off. But I'm giving you a chance of 1/9 of 1% to pull it off. Or you can have a very happy life, full and decent life. If you hesitate more than 1/100th of a second how you answer, he won't ever come back.
If you were a scholar of the 21st century, looking back on yourself and the history of ideas in this century, how would you rate yourself?
Probably as a rear guard. It's again most searching and upsetting question in some ways. Probably as someone who stayed in Europe rather than go to America, where God knows the generosities are greater, the chances and the élan vital is greater, who has hung on, and it was very, very difficult after the Cambridge failure and before I could go to Geneva, was hung on because there's got to be still a few people who remember the inventory of that very, very great culture, roughly from the Renaissance to Auschwitz, to the downfall, the polyglot, liberal, humanistic culture. And my masters, great teachers I still knew. I was immensely lucky, or even could hear lecture, were of that world. A linguist like Roman Jakobson, the greatest of all Jewish Kabbalist thinkers, Gershon Scholem. I still knew a Köstler, a Bronowski. In that sense, immensely lucky. So probably they'll say he never understood his own time at all. He was hanging on to something which was in many ways a world of ash, a dead world. I'm being deliberately self-cruel. I hope I'm not right, but it may well be that.